It's time to begin the meeting this evening. We do not have a quorum. We can do a lot of the business, but some of the items, unless someone else shows up, we will not be able to actually vote on things like approval of last year's minutes and a couple of other items. So I'd like to go ahead and begin. If you all join me and stand up, and we'll say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. Well, our first item on the agenda, we're saved. We now have a quorum. We've been waiting for you. All right, so you missed the first couple of items, but you're here just in time for our first item that requires a quorum, which is the election of officers for this next year. The first position that's open is the election of the chair. Do we have any nominations?
I nominate Dr. George Clow to be the 2022-2023 Budget Committee Chairman.
Second.
We've had nomination and a second. Are there any additional nominations? Don't all speak up at once. All right, if that's, do we need a motion to close the nominations?
You can declare them closed.
All right, I will just declare them closed and congratulate the winner.
You do have to vote. You do have to vote.
Oh, we do have to vote, yes. Could we have a vote then? All in favor of George Clow as the chair for this next year, please signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed? Election's over. The next position we have is the election to elect as the vice chair. Mr. Harris has been the vice chair in past years. It's probably almost as difficult a position as being the chair, but somehow folks struggle through it. So do we have any nominations from the floor for a vice chair for this next year?
I nominate Liliana Gomez to be Vice Chair of the Budget Committee for 2022-2023.
All right, Lillian's been nominated. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
She's been seconded. Do we have any additional nominations? And I guess the nominations are closed. Could we have a vote, please? All in favor of Lillian for vice chair for this next year? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? You got it. All right, well, we can move on to the next business. All right, we have in your folder are the minutes from the meeting on May 17th of last year. If everyone would take a couple of minutes and read it, please, and then we can vote on it. I think that was deliberate. Were you out in the hallway listening? We're reviewing the minutes of last year's May 17th meeting. I think everyone should have had enough time. Are there any corrections, deletions, additions to the minutes? All right, hearing none, could we have a motion to accept the minutes of last year's meeting, please?
I'll
It's
second.
been moved, been seconded. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And it's passed. Moving right along. Now we get to the good part. Ms. Saul, I believe you're on deck.
Okay. Thank you. I'll make sure my microphone is on, but not too close. I see some very familiar faces around the room, and I first want to start off by thanking you all for being here this evening. While this often feels like just another thing we have to do, it is very important and actually required by law that we have a public budget committee meeting. You'll hear multiple times throughout the meeting, we'll talk about an ORS or an OAR, or we're required to do things. So we'll move all the way through those. It is a bit of a process for me to share the information in a way that is beneficial to you and honoring your time, having sat through these meetings multiple years in a row for some people, but also giving the refresher that we all need, because we do only do it one time a year. So as we go through here, feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we go if I get going too fast, or if we just need more clarification, I'm happy to circle back and provide more detail. So in front of you, everyone should have a binder. And, well, you've already found your meeting minutes that were there. And in the front cover is a copy of the budget message that we'll get into a little bit later on. And then if we go through the tabs just to get oriented with the budget document, with the document, it starts with the calendar or tonight's agenda. Then behind the red tab is going to be the calendar of events. And then behind the clear tab is going to be the list of budget committee members and when their current term expires. And we like to joke in Hermiston, once you're on our budget committee, you're here. But know that it is a 3-year term. Each individual has a 3-year term. And then if the individual is willing and able to renew that term, it goes to the board, and the board appoints or reappoints those budget committee members. So that information is there. Behind the blue tab is a copy of the presentation we'll go through this evening. And then behind the yellow tab and the green tab are kind of the meat of the documents. That's where we'll get into the revenue budgets and then the summary expenditure budgets. So just like in years past, we'll be looking through the summary expenditure budgets, because nobody wants to spend all night looking through 186 pages of the full budget document that includes every payroll line, every every benefit line item. And remember, when the board actually adopts their budget, they adopt based on categories, function categories. So the detail that you're seeing tonight, even though it's summary, is still more detailed than we actually budget by at the function category level. So, but if you do have questions or want more details, I do have a copy of the full budget with me, or we can pull it up and get those additional details if we need. Now I just have to figure out how to get my computer out of full screen mode. So this evening, obviously, we'll do a budget committee overview. We'll look at the calendar of events. We'll look at the current year, we'll talk about revenues and expenditures for school districts and how schools are funded. We'll look at current year planning assumptions. Then we'll look at what planning assumptions were used for this upcoming budget year. And then we'll have the presentation of the budget message. Tricia said she's not going to read it word for word this year. No, and she's not required to read it word for word. So it is in your folder, and it will be available to the public as well. And then we'll look through some of the highlights of this document, and then we'll have an opportunity for public comment and discussion time for this committee. And then the plan right now is that we will recess for 2 weeks and then come back on May 16th and then adopt the budget at that time, or excuse me, approve the budget at that time. So the budget has multiple steps. So this is the recommended budget. After this committee will approve it, then it moves back to the board, and then the board actually adopts it. So sometimes I get my terms backwards. So with that, we'll dive right in. Like I said, if you have questions, feel free to stop me and we'll clarify them. So the budget committee, every district has to have a budget committee. We are governed by local budget law. And so the budget committee is made up of equal members, board members, and community members. So in Hermiston, we have 7 board members. So that means we have 7 community members that are part of our budget committee as well, for a total of 14 individuals. And every individual has the same level of authority in this committee. So it doesn't matter if you are an actual board member or if you're a community member. In this committee, everybody has the same authority. So anyone can make a motion or a second. Anyone can be the chair. Everybody is equal. The budget committee's job is to receive the budget message and the proposed budget, and then obviously hold meetings such as this to examine that information, and then also offer an opportunity for the public to provide comment. And then once it has approved this document, you can make changes if you desire. That's not something that we've typically done, but it could be done. And then it will move on to the school board, where they'll have one last opportunity to make changes if necessary, and then adopt it at that point after another round of public comment. And after the budget committee approves the document, your roles recess essentially for the remainder of the budget year. You'll never be called back for an additional mid-year budget or anything like that. It would just be the next budget cycle the following year. The budget committee, like we talked about, has a 3-year term. We try to stagger those terms so that we don't get in a situation where the entire budget committee is new faces. That way, that helps just kind of carry on the knowledge and history of how each budget committee across the state operates differently, just based on their community and the involvement. And so having that historical knowledge to bring from year to year is very beneficial for committees. These meetings are formal, and Brianna's taking minutes for us. Thank you, Brianna. And there is strict posting and advertising requirements. You've probably seen the notice in the newspaper if you read the East Oregonian. It was posted on 2 different occasions. And then if you've been to our school district website lately, there's been an annoying pop-up every time you go there. So we've put the information out. Again, like we mentioned, we're meeting tonight. It is our first public meeting. We'll take public comment here. We'll recess for 2 weeks and then come back on May 16th for the final consideration for approval. Now, some budget committees do it all in one meeting, and we certainly could. However, because we start this meeting early on in the budget process, and we allow you to take your binders home and really go through it and ask questions if you have. I really think it's important that we have that 2-week time. And then it also allows us to make any necessary corrections or changes. Remember, we operate on estimates for our revenue. So any new estimate that we might receive could make pretty significant changes to our budget document. So the longer we can wait to actually approve this document and send it on to the board, just make sure that we're presenting the most current and accurate information for our budget. So then after the approval, it'll go to the board on June 13th, where there'll be a public hearing, an opportunity for public comment, and then the adoption of the budget at that point for a July 1 start date. And we're not even going to talk about what happens if we don't adopt it by that time, because We're not going to be there. All right, so education funding in Oregon. So since 1990, school districts have been funded primarily on the state school fund formula. And essentially what that is a dollar value per student allocation. And there's additional weights or additional funding for special populations, so our special education, English language learners, those student populations that typically have a higher cost of serving their education needs. So for Hermiston, the state school fund is really our primary source of revenue in the general fund. And that's true for every school district in the state. And the formula consists of local revenues and the actual state payment from ODE. There are a couple other revenue sources that we could look at enacting. A local option levy, but the local option levy is not a good option for the district. So that would fund basically additional operation cost. But with a levy like that, typically comes at a very high cost. So a few years ago, we had an analysis done to say, okay, if we did a local levy, what could we generate? What type of funds could we generate? And we could generate less than $1 million, and it would cost our taxpayers about $3 per thousand. And that's really due to compression and all the complicated tax laws. And if we think back to like our bond levies, we can generate millions of dollars with $3 per thousand with bond, because bond dollars are outside of compression and outside of the Measure 5 limits. So for us in Hermiston, the option levy is not a good solution. And luckily, it's not one that we've even needed to explore. The other option, we're all very familiar with capital constructions bonds. Just note that those cannot be used for general operations, and we can only use those funds on the items that we have asked the voters and were approved by the voters. Any questions so far? Okay. So this is a snapshot of our current year budget. So you'll see that of all of our revenues right now, or all of our budgets, our general fund budget makes up 34% of all of our funds. But you'll note this bond construction is almost equal. So when we're not under a construction project, you'll see that the general fund really makes up a significant portion of our total revenues and expenditures. But right now it looks quite a bit smaller because we have that large construction project going on. If we take a look at the just the general fund now, and again, this is the current year's budget. In the general fund, 63% of that is made up of the state school fund, and that's actual payments from ODE. But what we need to consider is everything from the purple over to this local taxes is actually part of the state school fund formula. So when we add up all of those totals, we are over 75% is from the state school fund formula, and for a funding source in the general fund. So for the formula for Hermiston, it looks at, again, if we go back here as kind of a visual, if I'm saying this entire, everything from the purple over here to this blue on the local taxes is part of the formula. The formula calculates what our total allocation is and then works backwards by saying, okay, your total allocation is $62 million, but you're going to earn about $11 million from your local property tax collections and other local revenues. So the state will actually backfill the remainder of the formula with the $51.2 million. And remember, we work off of estimates all year long, so we tell the state, we think we're going to earn about $11 million in property taxes. So they pay us for the full year based on that monthly. And we have opportunities to make changes and corrections to our estimates, but they are still estimates until the spring of the following year when they start doing spring corrections and either issuing additional funds to the district or pulling funds back if we've overestimated, or I guess if we underestimated our local revenues and actually earned more and had to pay back into the fund. There are some school districts that actually earn more property tax revenue than they do state school fund. They actually send money to the state in their formula. So weird, but it happens. The estimates do vary, and there's a whole list of reasons why we might get a new estimate throughout the school year. If enrollments change either up or down, particularly at some of the larger school districts, that could then affect us. Because remember, it's one pot of money, and the allocation is on a per ADMW allocation. So as the total enrollment changes, the dollar per student amount changes as well and affects the entire state. So usually there's the spring correction, as I noted, and then there's parts and pieces in the formula that we don't really get into a whole lot of detail about, but the big one for Hermiston is the teacher experience factor. And so part of the formula looks at the experience of your teachers and how that compares to the experience of other school districts in the state. So they create a state average, and then either up or down the state school fund formula is adjusted. And Hermiston tends to have a younger teaching force, and partly in the fact that we have continued to be able to hire, particularly through times when other districts were holding steady or even laying off. Hermiston continued to be able to hire staff. So while it's great we were still hiring, it did have effects to our state school fund formula. But the idea behind that is that a more experienced teacher is going to come with additional costs because they're going to obviously be further on the pay scale, higher salary, and higher benefits as well. So it makes sense to have that formula in there. It just, we never really know where we're going to compare to other districts in the state. So we all use what's called the Program Budgeting and Accounting Manual, or the PBAM, and it helps guide every school district to make sure that we're being consistent in our the way we post our expenditures, so that we can pull reports and compare school districts, and we know that there's a line item for the business manager's salary. And we can compare every school district based on that line item. And the same if we want to compare what do we spend on elementary school supplies statewide. So everybody is using the same accounting system or format to know these are what those expenditures are. And our accounting code, for those that are familiar with accounting, typically an accounting code is, 4 or 5 digits long. Our accounting code is 16 digits, then it has a 3-digit account number afterwards. So it has the fund, the function, the cost center, area and sub-area, and all those things tell the who and the what is being and why we're purchasing things. So this PBAM, I still refer to it almost every day. I was looking at it right before this meeting, in fact, because it's so full of information and really helps guide how we're coding our expenditures and revenues. And it helps us to make sure that we're following local budget laws and the generally accepted accounting principles. So this is, I apologize, it's kind of hard to see in bold. This is a snapshot of our general fund budget expenditures for the current year. So it has, and it's broken by category, object categories. So salaries and benefits make up about 71% of our general fund budget. Accounts payable is 18%, transfers at 1%, and then reserves and ending fund balance at 10%. And the board has a policy that will end no less than, the policy is 8%, but we target 10%. It's a little bit deceiving when we look at it on a pie chart because this is 10% of the total expenditures, and our policy is 10% of revenues. So in the budget world, that equals out and is just fine. But when we actually get to actuals, because remember our actuals don't always match our budget because our budget is our plan. So that's why we'll see some different figures when we get to the actual, when we start looking at actual data. So the current year budget planning parameters the board set last year was to end no less than 10%, have a flat ADMW, so no enrollment growth from the prior school year. And then we use the state school fund estimate of about $8,509 per ADMW, and then use reserve funds if necessary. So the state school fund came in higher than where we had actually initially budgeted. The final number ended up being about $9.3 billion, split the 49.51. So that additional funding, we did not need to access the biennial reserve funds for this school year. So that was good news there. So when we start talking about how we can, how we determine which school or how each school is funded, we know that the bulk of our budget is made up of people. It's positions and staff and salaries and benefits. HR actually has a staff allocation formula based on kind of the best practice and what we've determined to be our standard or our targets with lower ratio student to teacher ratios at the elementary level, and then it grows as the student levels get a little higher. There's nothing set in stone for those ratios. It's just kind of our target and our what our practice has been here locally. Classified staff are also assigned to buildings based on an allocation on student needs and populations, special populations, and then just what those programs' needs are. So then we look at, okay, we've determined what our payroll expenses are going to be or estimated to be. How do we determine what each building can use for, the paper, their copier, all of those supplies they use in the classroom? So what we do is we look at a per student allocation. Now this formula used to be a lot more complicated. It also included additional weights for student populations, like the special education, EL. However, with the addition of Loma Vista this year, and we're still working on estimates and which students are moving from which buildings, we really had to look at just true basic estimated enrollment this year. So we increased the per student allocation amount and went based off of just the basic enrollment. So the column highlighted in green is the allocation that each building received for the next school year. And then it has right next to it the comparison for last school year. So you can see there's some really big changes, particularly, for example, at Desert View. Their budget is going from $91,700 to $67,150. And that's really just a result of the change of their enrollment numbers. So with the addition of Loma Vista and redoing the district boundaries, we're estimating that the enrollment at Desert View is going to go from 533 down to 395. And those are estimated numbers at budget time. So of course, they could be completely different at this point. And even when we're sitting at this table next year and looking at these, the 395 may not be where we actually end up at Desert View. But for budget purposes, that was our best estimate at the time of budgeting. So that said, obviously some big changes in the building, but historically we've not seen our buildings utilizing 100% of their building budget. So while it sounds like budget cuts and oh my gosh, gasp, what it really is just reallocating the funds because of that new building, and then really just bringing back our administrators and say, okay, what do our funding levels really look like at the building? And if we are mid-year and we're saying, nope, Katie, the allocations we got this year were not enough, then we can revisit that in the middle of the year if need be, if funding allows. But historically, we have not had an issue with buildings spending all of their budget allocations. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Okay, perfect. This slide is our budget planning parameters for this school year, or sorry, for this coming school year. I'm still working in 3 budget years a little bit right now, so for the 22-23 budget planning parameters, the board set these at their March board meeting. So an ending fund balance target of 10%, and that's 10% of revenues. Flat ADMW, and that's flat from the current school year. And then a state school fund estimate of $9.299 billion, split 4951. So that equates to about $9,283 per ADMW. And then utilizing the PERS and the biennial reserve funds up to $750,000 each, if necessary. So the last few years, we've kind of put that caveat out there that we have these reserve funds set aside if we ever need them. But to be able to use them, we have to budget and plan for that. So the board has authorized us to do so for the upcoming school year, if it's necessary. If for whatever reason our funding comes in higher from the state and we don't need to access those funds, they would just remain for the next time they were needed. And as we keep hearing throughout the state as we are in different meetings, we know at some point there's a funding cliff coming when federal funds go away after we've had a time of federal funds, and they go away and they're not backfilled with other state funds, or the state is then left to kind of scramble and make up the difference, if you will. So we're preparing for that. So if we don't need to utilize those funds this year, they will remain for the future when and if that funding cliff does appear. Is this the one you had a question on?
So, actually, on ADMW, where are we at? The budget flat last year, well, where are we at on that compared to?
We're actually down about 100 ADMW from last year, but statewide, the entire state is down ADMW. So at a time where we would normally be seeing significant revenue reduction, we actually are seeing a positive spring correction because the entire state's enrollment is down. So if we're gonna have a reduced enrollment, this was the year to do it. And luckily, we did kind of come out the winner. There were additional factors in that as well. Local revenue across the state is up as well. So property tax collections are significantly up across the state. So not only were there added funds to the formula, there were less students, if you will, to divide it up with. And so this ADMW, the assumption is based on that reduced 100 from last year, so where we are right now. And that's basically what we do is we look at just the roll-up of our students. So we say, okay, all of our seniors are going to graduate, and we're going to bring in a kindergarten class about the same size that we have this year. So our kindergarten class, where we had typically seen about 400 in the last couple years, has been about 350 to 375. So in these budget planning, we're using that 350 mark. But if we do see additional students, that would increase, potentially increase our school fund. But again, if everybody sees an increase of students, so students coming back to public education, that the formula will be spread, it's spread amongst everybody. So likely just the reverse of what happened this year. So when we would typically be expecting to see a big increase, potentially it could be a decrease, or we could just be steady where we're at.
So, does that trend, I remember the Portland State studies that we've always, that trend was, we're down from that trend, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty significant down from that trend because we have historically low enrollments this year. And I think the Portland State study had projected us just to continue to grow sort of indefinitely. So, okay. All right, so we are to the budget message. Are you sure you don't want to read it?
Go for it.
Okay, so we are just going to hit highlights from the budget message, and then we'll dig into the other documents there as well. Our investment highlights for this coming school year, we're continuing to target support for students' health, well-being, and just increasing student achievement. Really, that's the kind of the pillar of the student investment account. So additional state funding. But also some of those targeted investments both in the general fund and then also our COVID response funds as well. We're continuing to utilize the voter-approved funds to continue the construction projects. We're so excited that those buildings, like you can actually see a school out there, and the finishes are going on in the inside, and so to be able to open those buildings and in the fall will be, just a great celebration for our community. And then we're already talking about the next project, so for the high school project to get started. So we are continuing to target our professional development, offer a robust curriculum and training for all staff. That's very important for us, both for our licensed instructional staff, but then as well as our support staff as well. We're continuing to support a full academic school year with a full schedule for students and extended learning opportunities. And that extended learning opportunities, we'll see that both in the student investment account as well as, again, those COVID response dollars trying to address that learning loss. And then continued focus on addressing our maintenance projects throughout the district. Our investment challenges for the upcoming year, we are facing historically low student enrollments this year and just the unknown of what next year is going to bring. Will we see those students returning to us and not only us, but the state as a whole to public education? And then the uncertainty of state and federal K-12 funding. We're getting our estimated allocations for our federal dollars, and most of them have seen cuts. Our Title I, was it 12%? Saw a 12% reduction just to our Title I funding. So that's really our reading interventions at the elementary school level. So being able to balance and make sure that we're still offering all the services that we have historically done, but then also operating within those grant fund allocations. Then just the uncertainty of additional support required to address student needs. We know that not only through the pandemic, but just our students need more. So being able to offer those supports to all students, and then also being able to attract, retain, and hire qualified staff to not only teach and support our students, but then offer those additional supports that we know our students need. So those are our challenges. All right. So this is a snapshot of our proposed budget for all funds. So it is down from last year's budget, and that's primarily due because our construction bond funds, remember on the first slide, they were about 33% of our total budget, and now it's down to 24%. And that's because we just continue to pay those construction bills. And actually, by the time we get to July 1, this balance will actually probably be less than the $49 million because I take a snapshot as of right now. Because remember, we can't spend a penny more than what we have allocated or appropriated. So it's better to budget a little bit more in case something happens between, now and July 1. I shouldn't say that on the bond project one, though. But just to be proactive and make sure that we have the budget allocations going forward. So, but overall, our total budget is going down, but our general fund budget has actually gone up. And that's primarily due to additional reserve funds. Sorry, this is an expense chart. But primarily due to a higher state school fund and then also higher ending fund balance this year rolling into next year for that beginning fund balance. Kind of along that same trend as we're seeing, 74% of our general fund budget is planned for salaries and benefits. So really the people make up our budget and really make our school district, so that makes sense that the people is where we spend our money at. All right. So now we can, we'll look through behind the green, behind the yellow tab, we'll start with the revenue. Behind the yellow tab, it starts with the fund titles and descriptions. And so what I want to point out is Fund 202, 203, 222, and 243 are actually, they'll be listed here in the budget document, but there's no new information in the proposed column. They only remain in this document because we're required to show 3 years of history along with the current information. So those funds were grant funds that are no longer being renewed. And then also point out that Fund 206, 290, and 291. 206 is a grant that we've had before, but we didn't know that we were going to get it this year, so it wasn't included in the initial budget. And then the same with 290 and 291. Those will actually be going to the board for budget approvals for the 21-22 school year here in May. And then we've also included them in the budget document for next school year as well. So those are new funds. So to point out some highlights in the general fund revenue, if you turn to the first page just after those, the fund descriptions, you'll see that there's some highlights on the page. And I just want to point out our interest on investments. This year we budgeted $500,000. That was a bit of an over budget. So we're just scaling that back to really be more in line with where our expected earnings will be for the coming year. I've also highlighted the participation fee line item. That's something the district has, at one time, we had a pay-to-play fee for our student athletes and clubs, and we've invested in, and said that we want students to participate, we want to remove that barrier and remove those participation fees. So we won't see any revenue in that line item. Going forward, we may see still some stragglers from maybe if I played a sport my freshman year, and then here I am a senior and that's been on my bill this entire time, and I go ahead and pay it. We might see some of those still straggling through, but for the most part, we've cleaned most of them up. The next item that's highlighted there is the fees charged to grants. So as our state and federal grants continue to grow, particularly our student investment account and then also our ESSER funds, the district is allowed to charge what's called an indirect charge to grants. And most grants are about 5%. Typically, or that's what we're allowed to charge. Typically for a lot of our grants, we charge about 1%. And that's basically, consider it the overhead. Like, we charge specific charges to the grant throughout the month, and then at the end of the month, we say, okay, this is what it cost us extra to manage this grant. So we charge that fee to the grant, and then it goes to the general fund as revenue. So typically, we've been about that 70 to 90 mark, but because, particularly the student investment account, we're expecting to see that increase significantly there. And then the last one that's highlighted on that page is the Interfund Transfers, and that just went up from the $1,250,000 to $1.5 million, and that is just because of the board's authorization to transfer $750 and $750 out of those two reserve funds. You'll see that the most recent budget, but then there's 2 zeros in the columns just before that, because while we budgeted to be able to access those funds, we didn't have to access funds in 1920 and 2021. So those are zeros. So sometimes the format of this document throws people off because it's 2 years of actuals, the current year's budget, and then next year's proposed budget. So a little bit of different information there. So sometimes it's hard to compare, but that's what those are. As we through, I think that was the only highlights I have on the revenue side. And then, so if we move behind, or actually, is there any questions or anything else? Do you want time to look at the additional revenues, or are we can move on, and then if we want to circle back, we can certainly do that. So in the Expenditures Summary, and we are looking at all funds and all of the budget information is there. It is just rolled up to the function level in each fund for us. Again, I have some highlights, particularly on page 2. You'll see the remediation program went from $318,000 down to $45,000. And it's not that we're getting, this is typically where we budget our summer school program. So it's not that we're getting rid of summer school, it's just that we have new funding sources for it. So we were able to pull that out of the general fund and reallocate that $300,000 to other projects in the district, because later on page 16, we'll see the summer program grant in Fund 254, that is $900 and some thousand. So that in itself is a significantly bigger investment than what we had in the general fund. And then we also have funds set aside in in the student investment account as well, or, yeah. And then the next two highlights there, the district student safety and then the guidance services. Both of those budgets went down slightly. And again, it's not that we're getting away from those programs or anything. It's that those were, you'll remember a few years ago when we budgeted our student investment account, we weren't sure how much student investment account, if any, we were actually going to get that first year. So we double budgeted. We budgeted in the student investment fund, but then we said, these are real priorities for the district, so we also budgeted them in the general fund. So these two line items are really just us correcting and backing out some of those that we had double budgeted prior. So, so that's what's on page 16, excuse me. This. So if we look at fund, on page 16 there, in fund 251 is our student investment account. There's student safety for $112,000 and the guidance services for $349,643. So again, it's not that they went away, we're just better utilizing or those additional student investment account funds for these programs. Is everybody able to see that, or any questions on that one? Okay, so the next item is on page 4 for informational services. You'll see that there's a pretty significant investment there. That's for the addition of an additional FTE to support district communications. You'll see that the next one down there, the student or the other technology services, that budget actually went down. But again, we're planning to use our grant revenues to support the technology budget because again, we have the funds, they're one-time funds. So if we can utilize those to purchase technology and reserve our general fund for other uses this year, that's what we want to do to make sure we're getting the best use of those grant funds. The last one on the page there is the supplemental retirement. You'll see that it's going down from $250,000 to $200,000. So as part of our working agreement, our licensed and classified staff are, if were hired by a certain date and have had a certain number of years of service, continuous service, they're eligible for an insurance benefit after retirement. So that's actually being sunsetted through the working agreements and just working to bring down that liability. At one point, we were spending well over $500,000 a year just to support our retiree benefits. So while we want to honor our retirees, and it didn't completely go away for those that did start prior to, I believe it's 2002 and 2003, the benefit amount has been greatly reduced, and so over time we'll continue to see that budget line item go down as well. On page 21, that is our debt service fund. So that's the fund that when we collect property taxes that are for the bond, repayment of bond debt, it goes into Fund 300. And as part of one of those bond structures, we actually are required to set a certain a dollar amount aside each year for our QSCAB bonds. They were qualified school construction bonds during the last bond project. So we set those aside each year, and then in 7 years, I believe it is, we'll actually make one lump sum payment to pay off those bond debts all at once. So we're going to see each year our ending fund balance in that Fund 300 continue to grow as we set those funds aside. They are in an investment account that's separate from our other bond money. But so that ending fund balance will, it'll grow to about $31 million until we make that payment. And then obviously just the Fund 400 and 401 are our construction bonds. 400 is the regular bonds, and then 401 is our Awesome grant. So that, remember, that's a matching grant from the state, and it's a reimbursement grant, so we have to spend the money and then we request a reimbursement from ODE. But obviously, as we continue through these projects, those will quickly be depleted as we're moving through the projects. So in total, the proposed budget is $205,347,254. So at this time, I can either answer questions or we can open it up for public comment. Is there any questions or anything you need more detail on?
One question pertains more to the bond.
Yeah.
Does the state still have our last bond, we got a pretty good infusion because of
The facility grant.
the facility grant?
Yes. So the facility grant is still there, but it is very, very small compared to what it used to be. Really, they shifted those funds from the facility grant to the Awesome grant through that. The Office of School Facilities manages both, but the primary focus is the Awesome grant now. Well, that $6 million was pretty awesome. So, all right. So we will open it up for public comments now. This is the time we reserved in our budget meeting for public comment. Anyone wishing to address the board regarding budget information presented should stand and be recognized, then move forward to the microphone at the center table. Prior to making your comments, please state your first and last name, home address, and school or topic. Please limit your comments to a maximum of 3 minutes and address them to the chair. The Hermiston School District Board of Education also accepts public comment in writing to communications@hermistonsd.org prior to the meeting. Members of the community wishing to provide written comments submitted those statements to the district by 12 p.m. today. Brianna, were there any comments?
We did not receive any comments.
Okay, thank you. Persons wishing to virtually address the board submitted their name electronically by 6:30 p.m. prior to the board meeting being called to order utilizing the Google form accessible through the district website. Ms. Cordebrito, were there any of those?
We did not receive any requests for virtual comment.
Perfect. All right. We have one in person.
Mr. Chair, members of the Budget Committee, I do have a question. It was regarding the breakdown of the elementary schools and the budget that is going to each individual school. I guess I had a question in regards to if there is any other considerations or factors other than enrollment, such as like low socioeconomic status in which the money's going to be divvied up.
So the funds that Ms. Saul talked about here, those allocations per building just are part of the general fund. There are other resources that aren't a part of the general fund that do take into account for that. For example, Title I funding, our student investment account. We have like our ELL funding where we have specific programs that buildings do affect the overall funding of a building, but the allocations that were shared by Ms. Saul are the allocations per student that become a part of the operational budget for that year in the building, but don't reflect any personnel or program expenditures. Did that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Any other public comments? Mr. Bacon? Okay. So with that, we can move into committee discussion. And then if you have any questions or comments, and then this is essentially the end of our meeting. And we will recess after your comment period and then be back here on the 16th to actually, we'll review any changes if there are any, and then approve the budget at that time. So I will open the floor.
All right, do we have any discussion from the committee at all? Questions, comments? Katie will, oh, okay.
Mine's just about the revenue allocation. It's just a question because I'm curious. When ODE, when you talked about the local revenue plus the state payment and employee revenue, what, does ODE actually have those funds? Or is that just kind of the number they say would be allocated minus what the local revenue would be? I guess what would happen if local revenues came in less than what they budgeted or perceived?
So through the legislative process, they earmark a certain dollar amount for, or allocate a certain dollar amount for the state school fund using assumptions of what local tax revenues will be. If we don't meet those local tax revenues, the entire state would be reduced to be able to meet those, to stay within the parameter. So, so to answer yes and no, they have some of the money, and then they're assuming that they're going to get the rest of it. And in a time when the funds don't show up, school districts' budgets would be reduced to meet the level that they did receive.
Oh, so we would just pick up what?
Yeah.
I mean, since you've been a part of it, have we ever seen that in a shortfall where they had to have another legislative session to backfill or money or?
Not
0809.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I had just started in 0809, so,
So it has happened.
Yes.
But, yeah, those are extreme conditions economically everywhere.
Do we have any other questions or comments? If not, I think it's time to adjourn this meeting. I'll see all of you here, plus a couple others, I hope, in 2 weeks. Thank you for coming and spending your time here.
Board members, we do have a second.